Alright, this is the third in a series of recordings for the anatomy of the reproductive tract. And in this one we're going to be talking about support tissues or ligaments of the female internal genitalia specifically. Alright, here are all the different ligaments that I will be talking about just as an overview slide with some details in it, but I'll talk about each of these things in turn. Alright, before we get into those specific ligaments, you have to understand where the ligaments are actually coming from. So first of all, the pelvic fascia. Just like in the thorax and the abdomen, in the pelvis you have a visceral fascia, which is just that fascial layer that's covering the pelvic organs itself. So it would be orange, the orange layers in these images here. Visceral pelvic fascia. Parietal pelvic fascia is that fascia that's actually covering the pelvic muscles, so obturator internus, levator ani. Okay, and that's highlighted in green. The parietal fascia, pelvic fascia, has thickened portions that are actually going to extend directly from the lateral wall to the pelvic organs to provide support to those organs, and we'll talk about those, which ones those are. All right, now another important structure in the pelvis that is going to form ligaments is the parietal peritoneum. And I'll tell you how it does that, but first of all, how does it work? The parietal peritoneum is actually forming this blanket over top of all the different pelvic organs, and that's kind of what you can see with the blue and the green lines. So starting from posteriorly in the female on the left, you can see the parietal peritoneum is extending downward as the blue line over the rectum, and then it's going to extend as green over top of the uterus, the posterior part of the uterus, then over the anterior part of the uterus, then continuing as blue over top of the bladder, and then up the anterior abdominal wall. So you see how it forms this nice blanket that envelops all these structures. Alright, does the same thing in males, which is on the right. Now, what happens is as that parietal peritoneum sweeps over top of the rectum and then over the posterior part of the uterus, it forms a pouch, and that's what that yellow line is, the recto-uterine pouch. All right, and then as it's sweeping over the anterior part of the bladder, or over the uterus and then over the bladder, it's forming another pouch there, and that is the vesical-uterine pouch. In males, as the parietal peritoneum is sweeping over the rectum and then over the bladder, it is forming the rectovesical pouch. All right, so those aren't the ligaments, but it's just a finding as that parietal peritoneum is sweeping over top of these structures. Now, how does it form ligaments? How does the parietal peritoneum form ligaments? If you look at the insert on figure 334 first, where the red circle is, you can see that not only is the parietal peritoneum sweeping over the uterus, but it's also sweeping over top of the uterine tubes that are extending laterally. So there's parietal peritoneum that's sweeping over top. It's coming up from the posterior, and then it's going to sweep over top of the uterine tubes and then sweep anteriorly to come up the anterior side. And so you're getting, anytime you have two layers of parietal peritoneum that are joining together, you're getting ligament. Okay, so a double layer of connective tissue is a ligament. And in this case, it's called a broad ligament. And so you can see how you get these wings forming, which a parietal peritoneum, which is broad ligament. Now, the broad ligament can actually be broken down into different subcomponents depending on its relationship to some of the uterine structures. So if we go to the lower figure, you can see the blue arrows extending upward. That's parietal peritoneum as it goes up the uterine anterior part of the uterus, and then it sweeps over top of the uterine tube, you can see, and then it comes down as the red arrows. That's a double layer of connective tissue. It is broad ligament, but in that particular region where those arrows are, shaded also in orange, that's called mesometrium. Now if you go out a little bit further, you can see a green shaded box where the parietal peritoneum comes up over top of the uterine tube and back on itself. That would be another specific region of double connective tissue, and so it's called mesosalpinx because it's related to the uterine tube, salpinx uterine tube. Now you can also see, if you continue to follow that mesosalpinx as it goes over top of the ovary, you can see there's another double layer. So that particular region is called the mesovarium. All right? So mesovarium plus mesosalpinx plus mesometrium makes all of the broad ligament. All right? So when we get to the lab, you'll be able to see that a little bit more clearly. So that's how the broad ligament, the parietal peritoneum forms ligament, and it supports the uterine tubes and the uterus in the pelvic cavity. Other ligaments. The transverse cervical ligament is indicated by all the different green circles in this image, and all it is that parietal pelvic fascia thickening and extending from the lateral wall, pelvic wall, to the uterus. So the ones that it is extending transversely is the transverse cervical ligament. It's important because within that transverse cervical ligament is the uterine artery and the ureter, and you can see that in plate 370. All right? So that's the importance of the transverse cervical ligament. The uterosacral ligament, as the name implies, is that parietal pelvic fascia extending from the sacrum to the uterus, and specifically to the cervix of the uterus. So you can see that highlighted by the red circle. A better image is this one here, where you can see the red circle is showing the uterosacral ligament. All right. The green arrows are pointing to another ligament called the round ligament. All right. The round ligament runs from the anterior part of the fundus of the uterus, and it's going to extend to the anterior abdominal wall, and it's actually going to enter into the inguinal canal and extend and anchor itself within the inguinal canal. This ligament is the homologous structure in males is the vas deferens. Okay, so embryologically they have the same origins, but in females it closes off and it becomes a ligament. In males it stays functional as the vas deferens. So that's the round ligament. Another couple of ligaments. The ovarian ligament, or the ligament of the ovaries, connects the uterus and the ovary. And then there's the suspensory ligament of the ovary, which is a ligament that is running from the lateral wall of the pelvis toward the ovary. And you can see that in this diagram here. Now, within that suspensory ligament is the ovarian artery, vein, the sympathetic nerve fibers, and lymphatics. They're all embedded in that suspensory ligament, and as the name implies, it's going to help to suspend the ovary and support the ovary to maintain its position in the uterine cavity. All right, so you can see the broad ligament nicely in this diagram, and you can see that the round ligament, the ovarian ligament, the ovary, the suspensory ligament of the ovary, and the uterine tube are all embedded within that broad ligament. All right, so that's just a quick overview of these different ligaments and the structures associated with them.